I was sitting at my kitchen table only 4 days after burying my husband of 41 years when I opened a formal letter from a real estate lawyer. My own son had hired him to structure my life. They looked at me and saw a fragile widow, trapped in a large house I could no longer manage, just waiting for someone to take the reins. But while my daughter-in-law was busy picking out beige wallpaper for a tiny guest room in Arizona, I was in the attic, packing my mother's quilt and my favorite copper pot. I wasn't preparing to surrender. I was preparing to disappear to a coastal sanctuary in Maine that they never even knew we owned. Imagine the silence in that empty house when my son finally arrived to manage me, only to realize his mother had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. Before I share exactly how I reclaimed my freedom and my dignity, I would love to know, what beautiful city or town are you joining us from today? Please, leave a comment below. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, the same way it always had. It was soft and golden, catching the dust in the air on the breakfast table. But nothing else in my life was the same. My husband of 41 years had been buried only 4 days earlier. I was standing at the sink, washing a single coffee mug, thinking that I had never truly understood the word alone until that exact moment. The house felt too quiet. It was a silence that pressed against my ears, heavy and cold. The phone rang before I finished drying my hands. I looked at the caller ID. It was my son, Christopher. "Mom," he said when I picked up. There was something in his voice that I could not quite place at first. It was not grief. It was not the exhausted tenderness of a son checking on his grieving mother. It was something else. It was something measured. It was prepared. It sounded like he had rehearsed exactly what he was going to say next. He told me that he and Victoria had been talking. Victoria is my daughter-in-law. She is a woman who likes to have a plan for everything, even things that are not hers to plan. Christopher said they thought I should come stay with them for a while, just until things settle down, he said. I told him I appreciated the offer. I told him I was managing just fine. "It is a big house for one person, Mom," he said. His voice was smooth like a salesman. All those stairs, all that maintenance. Victoria and I have been thinking about the guest room in our place in Scottsdale. We just had the floors redone. It is very nice. I looked around my kitchen while he talked. I saw the copper pots hanging above the stove that Arthur had bought me for our 20th anniversary. I saw the blue curtains I had sewn myself the summer Christopher was born. I even looked at the crack in the plaster near the back door. Arthur had promised to fix that crack for 11 years and never did. I had grown to love that little crack the way you love someone's small imperfections. "This is my home, Christopher," I said. My voice was firm, but my hand was shaking slightly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Of course it is," he said eventually. "Of course it is. I just meant, we worry about you. We do not want you rattling around that big place all by yourself. Think about the equity. Think about how much easier life would be in Arizona." I thanked him again, and we said goodbye. I set the phone down on the counter and sat very still for a long time. I realized then that my son was not just calling to see how I was doing. He was calling because he and Victoria had already decided what my future should look like. They were looking at my life as if it were a problem that needed to be solved, or a ledger that needed to be balanced. They saw a grieving widow. But I remembered what Arthur had told me. I was stronger than they knew, and I was not ready to let anyone else hold the pen while my story was still being written. After I hung up the phone with Christopher, the silence in the kitchen felt even heavier than before. I stayed in my chair for a long time. I just sat there, looking at my hands. They looked older than I remembered. I looked around the room, really looking at it. Not as a piece of real estate worth $1,800,000, but as the place where my life had actually happened. To my son and his wife, Victoria, this house was an asset. It was equity. It was a problem of taxes and maintenance that needed to be solved. But to me, it was a museum. It was a sacred gallery of 41 years of being a wife and a mother. I stood up and walked over to the stove. I reached out and touched one of the copper pots hanging on the rack above the burners. They were heavy. They were polished. Arthur had bought them for me on our 20th anniversary. I remember that day so clearly. We did not have much extra money back then. We were still worried about the mortgage and saving for Christopher's college. I had seen those pots in a window in downtown Greenwich and mentioned how beautiful they were. I never expected to own them. But on that anniversary morning, there they were. Arthur had saved for 6 months, skipping his fancy lunches at work, just to buy them for me. Every time I cook a meal in those pots, I feel that love. How can you put a price on that? How do you explain to a realtor that a pot is not just a pot? Then my eyes drifted to the windows. I saw the blue curtains. They were a bit faded now from the afternoon sun, but I could never bring myself to replace them. I sewed those curtains myself during the hottest summer I can remember. I was 8 months pregnant with Christopher. I remember sitting at the old sewing machine, my feet swollen, my back aching, but I was so happy. I was nesting. I was building a world for the little boy I had not yet met. Every stitch in that fabric was a hope. Every hem was a prayer for his future. Now, that same boy wanted me to pull those curtains down and leave them behind for some stranger to throw in the trash. The thought made my chest ache. I walked toward the back door, the one that leads out to the garden. And there it was, the crack in the plaster. It started near the top of the doorframe and zigzagged down about 6 inches. It was a small thing, a tiny imperfection. Arthur had promised to fix that crack for 11 years. Every spring he would look at it and say, "Evelyn, I am going to get some spackle and fix that doorframe this weekend." And every weekend, something else would happen. We would go for a drive, or we would spend the day working in the yard, or we would just sit on the porch and talk until the sun went down. He never fixed it. And eventually, I stopped asking him to. I realized that the crack was part of us. It was a reminder that life does not have to be perfect to be wonderful. It was a reminder that we chose time together over chores. I ran my thumb over the rough edge of the plaster. To Victoria, this crack was a reason to lower the asking price. To her, it was a sign of neglect. But to me, it was a sign of a life well lived. It was a sign of a husband who was too busy loving his wife to worry about a little bit of a shifted foundation. I looked at the folder Christopher had left on the table. I thought about the house in Scottsdale he wanted me to move into. He said it was modern. He said it was efficient. But I knew what it really was. It was a house without cracks. It was a house without faded curtains. It was a house without a history. It was a place where I would be a guest in someone else's life, surrounded by beige walls and new furniture that smelled like a factory. I realized then that I could not sell this house because it was not just wood and brick. It was the only place left on earth where Arthur's presence still lingered in the air. If I left, I would be leaving him behind. And I was not ready to do that. Not yet. My mind drifted back to the end. It is strange how the mind works when you are grieving. You try to remember the happy times, the vacations, and the holidays, but your thoughts always pull you back to the final days. It had all happened so fast. One day, we were planning a trip to the Finger Lakes, and the next day, Arthur was complaining about a dull pain in his side. We thought it was just age. We thought it was perhaps something he ate, but it was not. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors said the words with such clinical coldness. They told us it was advanced. They told us we were looking at months, not years. We were diagnosed in July. By the time the leaves were starting to turn gold in late October, he was gone. 3 months. That was all we got. 90 days to say goodbye to 41 years. Some people say they want to go quickly, but let me tell you, there is a cruelty in that speed. It gives you no time to catch your breath. I remember the day we came home from his very last hospital stay. We both knew it was the last one. The doctors had stopped talking about treatments and started talking about comfort. The drive home from the hospital was quiet. The air was crisp, and the sky was that deep, aching blue that you only see in autumn. Arthur was sitting in the passenger seat. He looked so small. He had always been a steady man. A man who filled up a room with his presence. But the illness had carved him away until he was almost translucent. He reached out and took my hand. His skin felt like old parchment, thin and dry. But his grip was surprisingly firm. We were pulling into our neighborhood, passing the houses we had known for decades. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was raspy, but he sounded more like himself than he had in weeks. "I need you to promise me something. Anything." "Arthur," I told him. I would have promised him the moon in that moment. I would have promised him forever if I could have. He squeezed my hand. He looked at me with those brown eyes that had never stopped looking at me with adoration. "Do not let them make your decisions for you," he said. He did not have to say who them was. We both knew. We loved Christopher, but we knew our son. We knew he had a tendency to listen to Victoria's ambitions more than his own heart. We knew they would try to manage me. They would try to tuck me away in a corner where I was safe and quiet and out of the way. "You are stronger than you think you are, Evelyn," Arthur told me. "You have always been the spine of this family. You just never had to show it because I was standing in front of you. But I am not going to be there to remind you anymore. So you have to remember it for yourself. Do not let them shrink your world." I promised him. I held his hand all the way into the driveway. We sat in the car for a long time after I turned off the engine. Neither of us wanted to be the first to let go. Neither of us wanted to open the door and step into a house that was about to become a place of hospice instead of a home. We just sat there in the silence of the car, watching the leaves fall onto the windshield. That promise stayed with me. It was there when I was sitting at the funeral. It was there when the neighbors brought over casseroles and looked at me with pity. And it was there, loudest of all, when Christopher started talking about Scottsdale. Every time I felt myself starting to give in, every time I felt too tired to fight their structured plans, I would feel the ghost of Arthur's hand squeezing mine. I realized that the house in Maine, the little white house that no one knew about, it was the place where I could still be Evelyn Sterling, a woman who made her own coffee and watched her own sunsets, instead of just a widow who was being managed by her children. I looked at the crack in the kitchen wall one last time and whispered to the empty room. "I am remembering, Arthur. I am not letting them decide." The calls started before the thank you notes from the funeral had even been written. My son, Christopher, called again 4 days after our first conversation, but this time I could hear another breath on the line. Victoria was there. My daughter-in-law has a voice that is always bright and efficient. It is the particular way of someone who has already made a decision and is now simply informing you of it. It is a corporate voice, a voice that belongs in a boardroom, not a kitchen. "Evelyn, honey," she said. "We have actually been doing some deep research. Just some due diligence for the family's future, you know." I set down my pen. I had been sitting at the small desk in the hallway, writing to Arthur's sister in Phoenix. I had been telling her about the service. I had been describing the way the afternoon light had fallen through the chapel windows, turning the flowers to gold. But Victoria did not want to talk about light or flowers. She wanted to talk about the housing market. "The values in Greenwich have gone up significantly in the last 18 months, Victoria continued. Her voice was climbing with excitement. "Christopher and I looked at the recent sales on your street. Your house, with the 4 bedrooms and the original crown molding, it could list for $1,800,000 right now. Maybe even more. If we do some light staging. $1,800,000. I looked at my hand, still holding the pen. To Victoria, that number was a trophy. It was a jackpot. It was a pile of money that was just sitting there, trapped in old wood and brick. But as I sat there, I did not see $1,000,000. I saw the night Christopher had the croup, and Arthur walked him up and down the hallway for 6 hours. I saw the Christmas morning when we stayed in our pajamas until noon, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and the smell of pine. "I am not selling my house," I said. My voice sounded small in my own ears, but it was steady. "Mom!" Christopher jumped in. I could hear him softening Victoria's edges. He always did that when he thought I would notice her claws. "We are not saying you have to do anything today. We just think it is worth considering. You would have the equity. You could live somewhere smaller. Somewhere. Easier." "Where exactly am I supposed to live, Christopher?" I asked. "With us," Victoria said quickly. "We have the guest room. It is actually very nice. We just redid the floors with high-end laminate. It is very modern, very clean." I closed my eyes. I could feel the conflict rising in my chest. It was the clash of two different worlds. To them, life was about optimization. It was about moving equity from a stagnant house into a liquid account. It was about being sensible. But they did not understand that at 67 years old, I did not want to be sensible. I wanted to be surrounded by the things that knew me. I wanted the floorboards that creaked in the exact spot where Arthur used to stand. The taxes alone, Evelyn, Victoria added. She was relentless. Think of the $28,000 a year you are sending to the town. That is nearly $2,500 every single month. For rooms you do not even use. It is just not a sound financial strategy for a widow. A sound financial strategy. I realized then that she saw me as a liability. She saw my grief as a weakness that made me incapable of managing my own life. They were a machine of efficiency, and I was the old part that needed to be replaced. I felt a coldness settle in my bones. I told them I would think about it, just to make the phone stop ringing. But as I hung up, I looked at that $1,800,000 house and I knew one thing. It was not for sale, because my soul was still living in it. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the big bed that felt far too large without Arthur's warmth beside me. I kept thinking about that guest room in Scottsdale. I began to picture it in my mind, and the more I pictured it, the more it felt like a cage. A very expensive, very clean glass cage. I knew their house in Arizona. It was beautiful, in a way. It was full of white furniture and glass tables and abstract art that cost more than my first car. But it was a house where you were afraid to spill a drop of water. It was a house where every pillow was chopped perfectly in the middle. I imagined myself in that guest room. I saw the beige walls. I saw the brand new carpet that smelled like chemicals and factory floors. I saw the window that faced a grey concrete wall and a neighbour's air conditioning unit. In Greenwich, I can look out my window and see the oak tree. I can see the seasons change. I can see the birds that have been building nests in the same branches for 10 years. In Scottsdale, I would be looking at a wall, but it was more than just the view. It was the loss of my agency. I thought about living at Victoria's mercy. I thought about folding myself into the corners of her carefully organized life. I would be the grandmother in the back room. I would have to ask permission to use the kitchen. I would have to ask how to work the high-tech stove. I would have to listen to her talk about real estate values and return on investment at every single dinner. I would be a guest. And a guest is someone who eventually has to leave, or someone who is always careful not to overstay their welcome. I have not been a guest in 41 years. I have been the queen of my own castle. I have been the one who decides when the tea is made and when the lights go out. Permission. That word kept echoing in my head. Having to ask permission to live. Having to explain why I wanted to go for a walk, or why I wanted to keep a certain old chair. Christopher and Victoria thought they were offering me a rescue. They thought they were throwing me a life jacket, but they did not realize they were actually offering me a leash. I thought about the little house in Maine, the one they did not know about. I thought about the porch that looked south toward the water. There, the air smelled like salt and pine needles. There, the neighbours did not care about staging or market peaks. They cared about whether the tide was coming in or going out. I realised that if I went to Scottsdale, I would be dying before I was actually dead. I would be giving up the very thing Arthur told me to keep. My strength. My ability to choose. A glass cage is still a cage, no matter how much the floors cost. I sat up in bed and looked at the moon through the branches of my oak tree. I am not going, Arthur, I whispered into the dark. I am not going into the cage. I felt a sudden rush of energy. It was not fear anymore. It was a plan. I realized that the only way to escape the pressure of my son and the efficiency of his wife was to move toward the one place where I was still completely myself. I reached out and touched the empty pillow beside me. I could almost hear Arthur's quiet laugh. He would have hated Scottsdale even more than I did. He belonged where the air was cold and the people were real. And that was exactly where I was going. I was 67 years old. I was a widow. But I was still Evelyn Sterling. And I was about to show my son that his market research had missed the most important value of all, The value of a woman who refuses to be managed. It was a Wednesday morning in early April. I had been sitting on the back porch with my tea, watching the first tiny buds on the oak tree. The air still had that New England chill, the kind that reminds you winter is not quite finished. Then, I heard it. The sound of a car pulling into the gravel driveway. I did not need to look at the window to know who it was. I felt something cold and heavy settle in my chest. I opened the door before he could even knock. My son, Christopher, stood there. He was wearing his expensive coat and carrying a thick leather folder under his arm. He looked tired, smelling like stale airport coffee and Victoria's perfume. "Christopher," I said. "I was not expecting you." "I wanted to see you, Mom," he said. He kissed me on the cheek, but his eyes were already scanning the hallway, looking for things that needed to be fixed or packed. We sat at the kitchen table. I went to put the kettle on, but he stopped me. He opened the folder right there, on the spot where Arthur used to read the Sunday paper. He did not ask how I was sleeping. He did not ask if I was eating. He just started talking about the market. "I talked to a specialist in Greenwich, Mom, just to get a sense of things. The house could list tomorrow for a very high price. But we have to move fast." "I did not ask you to talk to a realtor, Christopher," I said. I kept my voice low. I did not want to fight. "I know," he said. He looked up at me with those brown eyes. They were Arthur's eyes. It was a cruel trick of nature, seeing the man I loved in the face of the man who was trying to push me out of my home. "I am just trying to help you. Dad would have wanted you to be taken care of. He would not want you struggling. Your father wanted me to make my own decisions," I replied. Christopher pressed his lips together. He flipped a page in the folder. It was a spreadsheet. It was full of numbers and red highlights. "The thing is, Mom, this house has 4 bedrooms. It is huge. The property taxes alone are $28,000 a year. $28,000. That is money that could be going toward your care in Arizona. You were paying those taxes together. It is different now. You are on a fixed income." That landed exactly the way he knew it would. It was a weight. $28,000. I thought about the town hall and the bills that would come in the mail. He was using my own fear of the future against me. He was making me feel like a burden to myself. I turned away from him and looked out the window. Outside, the oak tree looked so steady. It did not care about taxes or spreadsheets. It just grew. "Leave the folder," I said. I did not look at him. I wanted him to leave before I started to cry. "I will look at it, I promise." Christopher seemed relieved. He thought he had finally broken through my stubbornness. He hugged me, told me he loved me, and drove away back toward the airport. I stood in the driveway until his car disappeared. I felt like a stranger in my own yard. But I was not broken. I was just playing a part. I was letting him believe he had won, so that I could have the time I needed to finish my own plan. After Christopher's car was gone, I went back into the kitchen. I picked up that leather folder. It felt heavy, like a lead weight. I walked over to the small cabinet beneath the telephone. I opened the drawer and placed Christopher's market research inside, but I did not just leave it there. I lifted up a stack of old phone books and a yellowing folder that had been sitting there for 5 years. I placed Christopher's folder at the very bottom. Then, I placed my secret folder on top of it. I sat down and opened it. Inside were the deeds to a small Cape-style house in Camden, Maine. There were photos of a porch that looked out over the Atlantic Ocean. And there were letters, dozens of letters from a woman named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor and I had been best friends for 34 years. We met at a school fundraiser in 1991. Our sons were in the same second-grade class. We had been placed next to each other at a table selling lemon bars and brownies. Within 45 minutes, we had solved each other's most pressing problems and made each other laugh harder than we had in months. Certain friendships are not about how often you see each other. They are about a deep soul connection that does not require maintenance. Eleanor was that for me. When her husband left her in 2009, she did not stay in Connecticut to be pitied. She took her settlement money, moved to the coast of Maine, and bought a house on a hill. She painted her shutters dark green and told me it was the first place she had ever lived that felt entirely like her own. I visited her that first summer. I fell in love with the smell of salt and pine. I loved the way the morning light was blue and clean. Arthur came with me the second year. We stood on Eleanor's porch together. Arthur took a deep breath of that cold Maine air and said, "Evelyn, this is a place where a person could actually breathe." In 2018, we found a small house, just 3 streets up from Eleanor. It was for sale by an estate. It was simple. It was quiet. We used an old retirement account that neither of us had touched in 20 years, about $160,000. We bought it, and we told almost no one. It was not a secret born out of lying. It was a secret born out of self-preservation. We knew Christopher and Victoria would have strong opinions. They would have called it a bad investment. They would have told us the taxes were too high or the roof was too old. But for Arthur and me, that house was our private sanctuary. It was the place where we were not parents or grandparents or taxpayers. We were just 2 people who loved the sea. After Arthur died, that house became my lifeline. It was the only place on earth where Victoria's spreadsheets could not reach me. I looked at the photos of the dark green shutters. I thought about Eleanor waiting for me. We were 2 women who had survived the storms of life. Divorce, loss, and the slow fading of our youth. I realized that Christopher's folder was full of prices, but my folder was full of value. $1,800,000 meant nothing if I had to lose my soul to get it. I closed the drawer and locked it. I felt a strange sense of peace. My son thought he was managing a grieving widow. He had no idea he was dealing with a woman who had already found her way home. I went to the sink and poured out my cold tea. I had a lot of packing to do, and I had to do it very, very quietly. My mind travels back to a very specific summer. It was the year 2010. At that time, life in Greenwich felt like it was moving at 1,000 miles an hour. Arthur was still working long hours at the firm. Christopher was starting his own career. Everything was about status and schedules and keeping up with the neighbors. We were exhausted, though we did not realize it at the time. We just thought that was how life was supposed to be. That July, Eleanor Vance invited us up to her new place in Camden, Maine. She had been there for a year after her divorce, and she sounded different on the phone. She sounded lighter. So Arthur and I packed the car and drove north on Interstate 95. I remember the exact moment the air changed. We crossed the bridge into Maine, and it was like the humidity and the pressure of Connecticut just vanished. The air became crisp. It smelled like salt water and crushed pine needles. When we arrived at Eleanor's house, it was late afternoon. She lived in a small place on a hill that looked right over the harbor. We did not even unpack our bags. We just walked out onto her back porch. I remember looking at Arthur. He was still wearing his city shoes and his expensive watch. He looked out at the water, where the lobster boats were bobbing slowly in the tide. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, turning the whole harbor into a sheet of hammered silver. Arthur stood there for a long time. He did not say a word. He just closed his eyes and took a breath. It was a deep breath. A real breath. I saw his shoulders drop about 2 inches. The tension he had carried for 40 years seemed to just leak out of him and into the wooden floorboards. He finally turned to me, and his eyes were clear. "Evelyn," he said. He sounded like a younger version of himself. He sounded like the man I had married before the world told him he had to be a success. "Evelyn," he repeated, "this is a place where a person can actually breathe." We spent that week doing absolutely nothing. We did not go to fancy dinners. We did not check our watches. We sat on that porch and watched the fog roll in and out. We walked down to the docks and bought lobster right off the boat for $5 a pound. We sat by Eleanor's fire pit and talked about things we had forgotten we cared about. We talked about books. We talked about our childhoods. We did not talk about the stock market or the property taxes in Greenwich. For the first time in a decade, I saw my husband truly relax. He was not a vice president. He was not a father with a checklist. He was just Arthur. He told me that week that he felt like he had been holding his breath for 20 years and had finally found a window to open. That feeling, that sense of pure, unfiltered peace, it stayed with us. We drove back to Connecticut, but we left a piece of our hearts on that hill in Camden. I realized then that Maine was not just a state, it was a medicine. It was the only place where we could hear our own thoughts over the noise of the world. Fast forward to the year 2018. Arthur and I were getting older, and we started to notice a change in the way Christopher and Victoria treated us. They were becoming managerial. They would come over for Sunday dinner and start talking about our long-term care. They would look at our stairs and whisper to each other about chairlifts. They would ask about our estate planning with a little too much interest. We loved our son. Of course we did. But we also knew that his wife, Victoria, saw our life as a series of spreadsheets. We knew that if they ever found out we wanted a place in Maine, they would ruin it. They would tell us it was a bad investment. They would tell us it was too far from a hospital. They would turn our dream into a debate. One evening, Arthur and I were sitting in the library. He had an old folder from a retirement account he had started at his very first job in the early 1980s. It was a 401k plan that we had completely forgotten about for over 20 years. We had never touched it. We had never even checked the balance. When Arthur opened the statement, he blinked twice. "Evelyn, look at this," he said. The account had grown to over $160,000. It was a modest sum in the world of Greenwich real estate, but to us, it was a miracle. It was found money. It was a gift from our younger selves. We looked at each other, and we did not even have to say the words. We knew exactly what that money was for. We called a realtor in Camden that Eleanor had recommended. We told her we wanted something small, something simple. We did not want a mansion on the water. We wanted a home. We found the little white Cape-style house 3 streets up from the harbour. It was built in the 1950s. It had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that caught the morning sun perfectly. The price was exactly $160,000. It was like the universe had been holding that house for us. We bought it in cash. We handled all the paperwork through a small local bank in Maine. We had the mail sent to a post office box in Camden that Eleanor checked for us. And then we did something that some people might find strange. We did not tell Christopher. We did not tell a single soul in Connecticut. It was not because we were lying. It was because we were protecting something sacred. There are parts of a marriage that belong only to the 2 people inside it. The house in Maine was our secret garden. It was the one place on earth where we were not being managed or monitored. It was our insurance policy for our own souls. Arthur used to call it our escape hatch. He loved knowing that no matter how much pressure Victoria put on us, no matter how many spreadsheets Christopher brought to dinner, we had a key in our pocket to a different life. That secret gave us a sense of power. It gave us a sense of independence that was worth more than any amount of money in the bank. When Arthur got sick, he told me that his only regret was that we did not get to spend more time there together. But he made me promise that I would go. He told me that the house was his final gift to me. It was my freedom, bought and paid for. He wanted me to have a place where I could still hear his voice in the wind. As I sat in my kitchen in Greenwich years later, I realized that the $160,000 was the best investment we ever made. Not because the value of the house went up, but because it allowed me to say no. It allowed me to look at Christopher's $1,800,000 plan and realize that I already had everything I needed. I had a little white house, a friend on a hill, and a promise I intended to keep. After that unannounced visit from Christopher, the pressure did not stop. It only changed its form. It became digital. It became a constant stream of pings and notifications on my phone that felt like tiny pebbles being thrown at my window in the middle of the night. Victoria had started a campaign. She was sending me links to articles every single day. The subject lines were always the same. Financial freedom in your golden years. Why downsizing is the greatest gift you can give yourself. The hidden dangers of living alone after 65. I would sit at the kitchen table with my morning coffee, and my phone would buzz. I would look down and see another link to a senior living community in New Jersey, or a luxury condo complex in Scottsdale. Victoria called them options. I called them an invasion. She sent me a brochure for a place called The Palms. It looked like a hotel. It had a communal dining room and a calendar full of water aerobics and bridge clubs. The article she attached said that a large house is not a home, but a burden. It said that my memories were just clutter that was preventing me from moving into my next phase of life. It was a strange feeling, being told by a woman in her late 30s what my next phase should look like. To Victoria, my life was a series of problems that needed to be optimized. She saw a 4-bedroom house in Greenwich as a wasted asset. She saw my garden as a liability. Every link she sent was a subtle way of saying, "Evelyn, you are no longer capable of choosing your own path." The truth was, some days were hard. I will not lie about that. There were moments when the house felt like it was testing me. A week after the funeral, the light bulb in the upstairs hallway burned out. It was one of those high ceilings. Arthur always handled the ladder. I stood in the dark for 10 minutes, just staring at the dead bulb. I had to drag the heavy wooden ladder out of the garage, inch by inch. My back ached. My knees popped. I was terrified of falling. I kept thinking, if I fall, no one will find me for days. Then there was the thermostat. It was one of those new smart models that Christopher had installed for us last Christmas. It had a mind of its own. One night, the house was 62 degrees, and I could not figure out how to override the eco mode setting. I sat on the floor in front of the little glowing screen and cried. I did not cry because I was cold. I cried because Arthur was the one who understood the settings. He was the one who knew the exact click of the furnace that meant everything was working. But even in those moments of struggle, I never wanted to leave. I would rather fight a ladder or a thermostat in my own home than be safe and managed in a beige room in Arizona. Victoria's articles talked about carefree living, but they did not understand that care is what makes a life. Caring for my plants, caring for my remkua, caring for the house that saw my son grow up. That was not a burden. That was my purpose. I began to delete her emails without opening them. I stopped clicking the links. I realized that they were trying to wear me down. They wanted me to be so tired of the light bulbs and the taxes that I would just say, "Fine, do whatever you want." But every time I felt that exhaustion, I would look at the copper pots, I would look at the oak tree, and I would remember my promise. I was not a problem to be solved. I was a woman who was still very much alive. The final straw arrived on a Friday in early March. It did not come as a text or a link. It came in a formal, heavy business envelope. My name was typed out in a cold, serif font. No, dear Mom. No thinking of you. It was from a law firm in New Jersey that specialized in estate planning. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Arthur and I had planned our lives for 40 years, and I opened it with a butter knife. I read the letter twice because I could not believe what I was seeing. Christopher had not just talked to a realtor. He had retained an attorney. The letter was written in that clinical, legal language that is designed to make you feel small. It talked about the current financial landscape. It mentioned the untenable nature of the Greenwich property taxes. But there was one phrase that made my blood run cold. The attorney wrote that Christopher and Victoria wanted to discuss my future management in a structured setting. A structured setting. I whispered those words to the empty room. They did not mean a conversation. They meant a meeting. They meant a boardroom where people with degrees would decide when I should sell my house and where I should spend my nights. It was a move to take my agency away. They were treating me like a child who could no longer be trusted with her own toys. In that moment, I felt a deep, sharp betrayal. This was my son. This was the boy I had stayed up with through fevers and heartbreaks. I had taught him how to walk, and now he was trying to tell me where I was allowed to stand. I realized that the Victoria machine had finally won him over completely. He had traded his father's heart for his wife's spreadsheets. I looked out the window at the oak tree. It was bare, waiting for the spring. I thought about Arthur's voice on that last drive home from the hospital. Don't let them make your decisions for you. He had seen this coming. He knew that the world would try to shrink me the moment he was gone. I felt a strange clarity. The grief that had been a heavy fog for months suddenly lifted. It was replaced by a cold, hard fire. They wanted a structured setting? Fine. I would give them a structure they never expected. I picked up the phone. My hand was not shaking this time. I dialed the number for Maine. It rang twice before Eleanor picked up. "Eleanor," I said. My voice was clear. It was the voice of the woman who had managed a household, a budget, and a 41-year marriage. "It is time. I am coming up." "I have been waiting for your call, Evelyn," Eleanor said. She did not ask questions. She did not tell me what to do. She just made space for me. "The guest room is ready. The tea is on the stove. Just get here. I have a few things to finish here first," I told her. "But I will be there by the time the forsythia blooms." I hung up the phone and looked at the lawyer's letter. I did not tear it up. I did not throw it away. I simply folded it and put it in my pocket. It was the last piece of evidence I needed. I realized that my children were no longer on my side. They were looking at my life as a project to be completed. I stood up and walked to the attic. I pulled out the first box. I did not start with the big things. I started with the things that mattered. My mother's quilt. My favorite books. The copper pot. I was not leaving in defeat. I was starting a strategic withdrawal. Christopher and Victoria were waiting for a meeting in a structured setting. They were waiting for me to be reasonable. They were waiting for me to surrender. But they had forgotten one thing. I was Evelyn Sterling. And as Arthur had told me, I was much stronger than I had ever known. The move to Maine was no longer just a dream. It was a mission. And for the first time since October, I felt like I could truly breathe. Once I made the decision to leave, a strange kind of calm took over my life. I was no longer a victim of my son's plans. I was no longer a target for Victoria's emails. I was a woman on a mission, but I knew I had to be careful. If Christopher or Victoria sensed that I was preparing to move, they would move faster. They would bring in the real estate agents. They would try to block my bank accounts. They would come to save me before I could save myself. So, I began my silent escape. It was not a frantic rush. I did not throw things into garbage bags in the middle of the night. No, I did it with the same quiet method I had used to run my household for 41 years. I did it one box at a time. I started with the books. I had hundreds of them. They were my old friends, the stories that had kept me company while Arthur was at work or when the house felt too large. I bought sturdy cardboard boxes from the local hardware store, paying in cash so it would not show up on the joint credit card account Victoria sometimes monitored. Every morning after my tea, I would pack one box. Just one. I would label it old clothes or holiday decorations in case Christopher stopped by. Eleanor was my partner in this. Every week, I would drive to the UPS store in the next town over. I would ship 2 boxes to her house in Camden. She would stack them in my secret Cape-style house, waiting for me. By the end of March, my bookshelves in Greenwich looked a little thinner, but you would not notice unless you were really looking. And Christopher was never really looking at my books. He was only looking at the walls. The hardest part was the performance. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, the phone would ring. It was the Sunday call. I knew Victoria was sitting right there next to him, probably with a notebook ready to check off her progress with me. "How are you doing, Mom?" Christopher would ask. I would make my voice sound a little thinner, a little more tired. "Oh, I am managing, honey," I would say. The stairs were a bit much today. My knees are bothering me again. I could almost hear Victoria smiling through the phone. I was giving them exactly what they wanted. I was acting like the fragile widow who was finally wearing down. I was playing the part of the woman who was nearly ready to be reasonable. "Have you looked at that folder from the attorney?" he would ask. "I am still reading through it, Christopher. It is a lot of big words for me. I think I just need a little more time to process everything. It has only been 5 months since your father passed, you know. I used their own assumptions against them. They assumed that because I was 67 and grieving, I was slow. They assumed that because I was alone, I was helpless. So I fed those assumptions. I bought myself time by pretending to be the person they thought I was. In reality, I was more focused than I had been in years. I was going through my closets, deciding what mattered and what was just weight. I found the copper pot Arthur had given me. I did not ship that one. I wrapped it in a soft towel and placed it in the trunk of my car. That pot was going to be the first thing I touched when I walked into my new kitchen. Every night, I would sit in my quiet house and feel a sense of guilt, followed quickly by a sense of survival. I loved my son. I truly did. But I realized that I was fighting for my life. If I let them win, the woman I was would disappear. I would become a project. I would become a liability. And Arthur's promise would be broken. The secret was a heavy thing to carry, but it was also a shield. It kept me warm when the house felt cold. I was no longer a goer-for waiting for a structured setting. I was an architect of my own future, and the blueprint was already finished. The morning I left was a Tuesday in early April. It was that specific time of year in Connecticut when the world is caught between seasons. The sky was a pale, watery grey, and the air still felt like it belonged to winter. But then, I looked out at the front yard. The forsythia bushes were finally blooming. They were covered in those tiny, bright yellow flowers that seem to scream that spring is coming whether you are ready for it or not. I have always loved the forsythia. It is a brave plant. It blooms before the leaves even show up. It is the first bit of colour in a world that has been grey for 5 months. I took it as a sign. I had finished my packing the night before. My car was loaded, but I had been careful to keep everything below the window line. From the street, it looked like an empty car. The house was clean. I had arranged for the utilities to stay on for another month. I did not want any red flags to pop up in Christopher's digital world. I wanted to be long gone before anyone realized the bird had flown the nest. I walked through the house one last time. It was a strange feeling. 41 years of echoes were bouncing off the walls. I stood in Christopher's old bedroom. I could almost see the posters of baseball players on the walls. I stood in the living room and remembered the night we had the big blizzard in 1996, and we all slept in front of the fireplace because the power was out. The house was not just a building. It was a container for my entire adult life. Leaving it felt like a kind of death, but it also felt like a birth. Finally, I went into the kitchen. I stood by the back door. I reached out and touched the crack in the plaster. 11 years of Arthur promising to fix it. 11 years of me complaining about it. And now, as I stood there alone, I realized I did not want it to be fixed. I wanted it to stay exactly as it was. It was a part of our story. It was a reminder that we were not perfect, but we were ours. I forgive you, Arthur, I whispered. I was not just talking about the crack. I was talking about him leaving me. I was talking about the 3 months of cancer. I was talking about the 41 years of being so much a part of him that I had forgotten how to be myself. I forgave the house for being too big. I forgave the town for being too expensive. And I forgave my son for being too much like Victoria. I let go of the anger. I let go of the betrayal. I did not want to take those things to Maine. I wanted to leave with a clean heart. I walked out the door and locked it. The click of the deadbolt felt very final. I did not look back as I walked to the car. I knew that if I looked back, I might lose my nerve. I might see the oak tree and decide to stay. I got into the driver's seat. I put the key in the ignition. I reached over and touched the copper pot in the passenger seat. It was cool and solid. As I drove down the driveway and turned onto the main road, I passed the row of forsythia one last time. Those yellow flowers were like little lanterns, lighting my way out of Greenwich. I began to drive north. I was heading toward Interstate 95. I was heading toward the coast. I was heading toward a state where the air was cold and the light was blue. I felt a strange weightlessness. For the first time in my life, no one knew where I was. I was not a mother on a schedule. I was not a widow in a structured setting. I was just a woman in a car, driving toward a harbour. The road stretched out in front of me, grey and long. But in my mind, everything was turning yellow. like the Forsythia, like the morning sun. I was 67 years old, and I was starting over. I was driving toward my sanctuary, and for the first time since that Tuesday in late October, I did not feel alone. I felt like I was finally going home. The drive north was long, but for the first time in months I did not feel the weight of the miles. I watched the landscape change from the crowded grey highways of New Jersey and New York to the open, salt-air beauty of the Maine coastline. By the time I reached the town of Camden, the sun was beginning to dip. The sky was a brilliant shade of gold, and the water in the harbour looked like flat, polished silver. I pulled my car up the hill, right to the little white Cape-style house with the dark green shutters. Eleanor was already there, standing on her own porch just 3 houses down. She was wearing her old yellow rain jacket and holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She did not say a word. She just walked down the hill and handed me a mug before I had even opened my car door all the way. "Welcome home, Evelyn," she said. Her voice was steady and warm. I stood there on the hill, breathing in the air that smelled of salt and wood smoke. I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. It was the particular freedom of being exactly where you chose to be. I was here on my own terms. I did not need anyone's permission to be here. I was not a guest. I was the owner. Eleanor had been busy. She had already aired out the house and placed a vase of early daffodils from her garden on my kitchen counter. The kitchen was exactly as Arthur and I had left it. It was simple. It was quiet. It was full of light. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching the walls and the furniture we had picked out together in 2018. This was not an ending. This was a new beginning. Sunday arrived, as it always does. And with it came the phone call. I was sitting on my porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the lobster boats come back into the harbour. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was Christopher. I let it ring once, then twice before I answered. "Hey, Mom," he said. He used that careful, rehearsed warmth that he always deployed when he thought Victoria was listening. "How is everything going today? Did you look at those senior living brochures we sent?" "I'm doing very well, Christopher," I said. My voice was calm. It was the calm of a woman who has nothing left to hide. "I am actually in Maine." There was a long silence on the other end. A very long silence. "Maine?" he finally asked. He sounded completely confused. "What are you doing in Maine? Are you visiting Eleanor? Who drove you all that way?" "I drove myself," I told him. "And I am not just visiting. I am home." "What do you mean you are home?" His voice rose an octave. "Your home is in Greenwich. We have a structured meeting scheduled for Tuesday with the attorney, remember? You need to be here for that. My home is where I decide it is, Christopher. And I have decided it is here. In the house your father and I bought in 2018. The house in Camden." I could hear him drop something on his end. I could hear Victoria whispering frantically in the background, asking what was happening. "The house in Camden?" Christopher's voice was shaking now. "Since when? How? Dad never mentioned. We never saw any records of that." "No," I said firmly. "You didn't. Because it was ours. Your father worked for 40 years so that I could have this moment. He wanted me to be free, Christopher. He wanted me to live a life that was not managed by spreadsheets or real estate lawyers. And that is exactly what I am doing." The silence that followed was different than before. It was not the silence of a man preparing a strategy. It was a genuine, stunned silence. For the first time in his adult life, my son realized that he did not have the map to my life. He realized that the fragile widow he had been trying to manage was a woman who had been 3 steps ahead of him for 5 years. "I am not coming to the meeting on Tuesday," I said. "And I am not selling the Greenwich house on your timeline. I will decide what happens to that house when I am ready. Until then, I am here, and I am happy." I hung up the phone before he could respond. I did not do it out of anger. I did it because I was finished with the conversation. I took a sip of my coffee and looked out at the silver water. I felt like I had just put down a heavy backpack I had been carrying for half a century. I was 67 years old, and for the first time, The only person I had to answer to was myself. 2 days passed before Christopher called again. I expected another argument. I expected Victoria to be on the line, threatening me with legal talk about mental capacity or financial responsibility. I was ready for a fight. I had Eleanor on speed dial and my own lawyer's number tucked in my checkbook. But when I answered the phone on Tuesday evening, the voice I heard was different. "Mom?" Christopher said. He sounded young. He sounded like the little boy who used to come to me when he had a nightmare. "I am here, Christopher," I said. I am calling alone," he whispered. "Victoria is at her Pilates class. I just wanted to talk. Really talk." I leaned back in my rocking chair. "I am listening." "I am sorry," he said. The words came out in a rush, like he had been holding them back for a long time. "I am so sorry, Mom. I look back at the last few months, and I see what we were doing. Victoria. She is very focused on the future, on the money, on the equity. And I just went along with it because it was easier than fighting. I thought I was taking care of you, but I realize now that I was just trying to control you." He paused, and I could hear him take a shaky breath. "When you told me about the house in Maine, it was like a light went on. I realized that Dad knew you better than I did. He knew you needed an escape. He knew you were stronger than I gave you credit for. I feel ashamed that I tried to put you in a cage in Scottsdale." I felt a tear run down my cheek. This was the son I remembered. The one who had his father's heart buried somewhere beneath all that New Jersey ambition. "Thank you for saying that, Christopher," I said. "It means more than you know." "What are you going to do now?" he asked. "Are you really going to stay there all winter?" "The Maine winters are brutal, Mom." "I might," I said with a small laugh. "Or I might go to Florida. Or I might stay right here and watch the snow fall on the harbor. The point is, it is my choice. I have enough in my retirement and the house is paid for. I am not a burden, Christopher. I am a woman living her life. I want to come see it," he said. "Not to sell it. Not to talk about lawyers. I want to bring the kids. I want to see the place that made Dad so happy. I want to see the place where you feel like yourself again." "I would like that," I told him. "But there is a rule. No talk of market values, no talk of downsizing. And Victoria has to leave her spreadsheets at the door." He laughed, and it was a real laugh. "I think I can manage that." We talked for an hour after that. We did not talk about the future, we talked about the past. He told me memories of his father that I had forgotten. He told me about his own fears and his own stresses. For the first time in years, we were not manager and asset. We were mother and son. That evening, Eleanor came over with a bottle of white wine. We sat on the porch as the harbour lights came on, one by one, like tiny stars dropped into the water. The air was cold, but the blanket was warm, and the company was even warmer. "How do you feel?" Eleanor asked, just as she had years ago. I thought about the house in Greenwich with the crack in the plaster. I thought about Arthur's hands on the steering wheel. I thought about the $1,800,000 that I didn't need. "I feel like myself," I said. "I am 67 years old, and I am finally, truly home." To anyone listening to this story, please remember that your life belongs to you. Real love does not try to manage you. Real love makes space for you to breathe. It is never too late to reclaim your freedom. The harbour is waiting. The light is there every morning. You just have to be brave enough to drive north. I sat in my chair, listening to the quiet music of the tide hitting the docks below. I was strong. I was independent. And I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The last of the golden light is fading over Camden harbour now. The water has turned from a bright silver to a deep, quiet grey. Below my hill, the lobster boats have all come in for the night, and the only sound is the gentle lapping of the tide against the wooden docks. I am sitting here on my porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, with a cup of tea that is finally as hot as I like it. My heart feels lighter than it has in 41 years. I look at my hands in the twilight. They are the hands of a woman who has lived a long, full life. They are the hands that raised a son, that held a husband, and that sewed blue curtains in a kitchen in Connecticut. But today, they are also the hands that drove 400 miles to a new beginning. They are the hands that hold the key to a house that is entirely mine. Arthur was right. He knew me better than I knew myself in those final days. He knew that I had a spine made of steel, even when I felt like I was breaking into 1,000 pieces. I kept my promise to him. I did not let them make my decisions for me. I did not let them shrink my world until it fit into a single guest room in Arizona. I want to speak directly to you now. To anyone who is listening and who recognizes a piece of themselves in my story. Perhaps you are sitting at your own kitchen table tonight. Perhaps you are looking at a folder from a lawyer or listening to a child who thinks they know what is best for you. Perhaps you are wondering if the life you spent decades building still actually belongs to you. I want you to hear me when I say, it does. It always did. Real love is not about management. Real love is not about efficiency or market research. Real love makes space. Real love asks what you need, and then it trusts you when you give the answer. Arthur knew this. He built me an escape. Not because he thought I would need to run, but because he knew that true freedom requires somewhere to go. I am 67 years old. I know how to replace a light bulb. I know how to manage a thermostat I have never used before. And I know how to drive north in April with a copper pot in the back seat and a friend waiting on a hill with 2 cups of coffee. It is not too late for you. If you are sitting there wondering if the years have made you too tired, or too small, or too much a part of someone else's plans, please listen to my voice. The harbor is still there. The light is there every morning, blue and clean through the window. You just have to choose to go. Thank you for spending this time with me. If my journey has touched your heart, I would be so grateful if you would share your own thoughts in the comments below. We are a community of stories, and yours matters just as much as mine. If you would like to hear more stories about finding our strength and our independence, please consider subscribing to this channel. Until next time, take a deep breath. Remember who you are, and never, ever, let them make your decisions for you. I am Evelyn Sterling, and I am finally home.